afternoon, everybody who's joining our call. This is the Call for Service Subcommittee meeting, the subcommittee of the RIPA Advisory Board. And we'll call this meeting to order, and we'll start with introductions. My name is Angela Sierra. I'm an attorney with the California Department of Justice. I'm an advisor to our Division of Operations, and I'm the Attorney General's representative on the RIPA board. I'll turn it over to my co-chair. Oh, and I'm a co-chair of the subcommittee. I'm going to turn it over to my co-chair, Sandra Brown.
Good morning. Well, nope. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sandra Brown, a RIPA board member, former law enforcement, and I'm very excited to learn today from my co-chairs, Angela Sierra, on how to do this right. So thanks, everybody, for being here.
Great. Thank you, Sandra. Let's turn it over to, for more introductions of our subcommittee members, Sahar Durali.
Hi, this is Sahar Durali. I'm an Associate Director of Litigation and Policy at Neighborhood Legal Services of Los Angeles, and I'm also co-chair of the RIPA board through the end of the year. Hi, everybody.
Thank you. And we have Felicia Espinosa.
Hi, everybody. Felicia Espinosa. I'm here in Fresno, part of Root and Rebound. We work on all like the collateral consequences that it comes to the criminal legal system. I'm an attorney and focus on women in the Central Valley and have been doing this work for a few years. Before then, I have worked in government positions as an attorney, worked at public defender's offices, and also with California Rural Legal Assistance, directly representing farm workers and ag workers who have been unjustly denied their wages and have been suffering sexual harassment. So all in the Central Valley, which is home to me, born and raised in Fresno. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And Sheriff McMahon.
Good afternoon. John McMahon, the Sheriff of San Bernardino County. I'm new to the RIPA board, taking over from Sheriff Dave Robinson, who's now the president of state sheriffs and couldn't do both jobs. So excited to learn more about how this works and learn more about different perspectives as it relates to the reports and the data that's collected.
Thank you. And so thank you to all of our subcommittee members. I think we're going to have a really good meeting this afternoon. To start off, we will, I'm going to move, you were all given a copy of our minutes from the June 4th, 2020 subcommittee meeting. And so I'm going to move to approve those minutes. If we have a second.
I'll second the motion.
Great. Okay, so we'll take a vote, and I think that probably the easiest we'll do, I don't know if we have a consensus, let's all vote, maybe raise our hands and see if we have a unanimous approval.
Yes.
Can I vote on it if I wasn't at that meeting since I'm also new?
Yes, my understanding is yes, you can,
Okay.
or you can abstain. That's
okay. I vote yes.
okay. Sandra Brown, yes. Sheriff McMahon?
Abstain. I wasn't here.
Okay. Okay. And I will vote yes. And then a yes from Felicia. Okay, so the minutes are approved. Okay, so our next order of business, we're going to be given by our Department of Justice staff an overview of the portion of the annual report, our draft report, that will be addressing the issues of our subcommittee calls for service. So I will turn it over to our DOJ presenters.
Hi, and good afternoon. My name is Kendall Micklethwaite. I'm with the California Department of Justice, and I'll be giving the DOJ presentation today on the calls for service. My preferred pronouns are she, they. Just a visual description of my clothing for all of the audience here. I'm wearing a green shirt, albeit with a few lighting issues, and a black blazer. So I'm going to just briefly go through kind of the outline for this particular section, and then really open it up to the board to have a discussion of the vision and direction they want to take this section of this report. So there are really two different aspects of the calls for service in the report that we will be addressing. One of those is responding to bias-based calls for service, and another new kind of emerging area the board is looking into is related to mental health calls for service and crisis intervention. So talking first about responding to bias-based calls for service, the first section of the outline discusses training, policies, and procedures for both dispatchers and law enforcement. One area that we looked into was dispatcher training regarding responding to bias-based calls. As far as my research took me, the only training on community policing, or the only training on bias-based calls was community policing, cultural diversity, hate crimes, and gang awareness. Dispatchers are required to do additional training, about 24 hours every 2 years, kind of as a continuing legal education. But it's important to note when in this particular learning domain, the dispatchers are taught how to address hate crimes and talking to victims, but not necessarily bias 911 callers. CIT training or crisis intervention training is not required. However, a number of dispatchers do voluntarily sign up for the additional crisis intervention training. And I'll talk about that later in the presentation. Some areas just reading through the dispatcher trainings where perhaps the board would like to look into expanding training opportunities are tools that we could give our dispatchers on how to diffuse or de-escalate a potential bias-based 911 caller. Dispatchers typically are going to be our first point of contact with that person making a bias-based call. So ensuring that our dispatchers have the tools necessary to deal with that, and particularly to diffuse and escalate, de-escalate at that point of contact, could be an area of expanded training. Another area is just being able to assess when a bias-based call is being made, and how to mitigate that bias prior to dispatching or informing first responders of the situation they're going into. One area the board could explore, and this is the second area of the outline, is how to approach these holistically. Communities Against Hate is a group of about 15 national organizations that recommends a restorative justice approach to hate-based incidents. It's really two-pronged in the sense we need to increase our data collection of hate-based incidents, but also take a restorative justice approach. And by restorative justice, I'll quote from the report, it's a theory of justice that emphasizes repairing harm caused by this criminal behavior or making a false police report. And it's best accomplished through a cooperative process that allows communication between the person or the victim of that crime, that bias-based call, and the person who ultimately made that false report. In the report, I tell the story of Mira Ackland. Mira Ackland is a 9-year-old girl who this year in chalk wrote on her driveway, "Black Lives Matter." A neighbor ended up calling the police on her. And in this news article, this young girl explained how she felt uncomfortable in her own community. Simply charging that neighbor with a crime may not restore justice to this young girl. And it's an opportunity to, if the parties are willing, to have a conversation about the impact of that bias and truly allow healing within the community. Most community advocacy organizations do not support penalty enhancement bills. That being said, this year, I believe it was AB 1775, was a penalty enhancement bill that passed. And so it increased penalties for making a false police report, and then it also created an avenue for civil remedies for when false police reports are made. Exploring best practices for bias-based calls. Every agency should have a policy that addresses bias by proxy. And maybe a recommendation for the board to consider is law enforcement agencies adopting a policy on bias by proxy. One area I've already discussed is potential expanded areas that the board could look into is dispatcher trainings on how to determine if a bias-based call is being made. One thing that Smart 911 now uses, and I believe Jennifer Eberhardt covered in a study, is interrupting that bias-based call. And so potentially a dispatcher being trained to ask the citizen making this call, what is the suspicious behavior? And having the caller articulate what that suspicious behavior is, other than someone who simply doesn't look like to this caller that they belong in a particular area. So kind of interrupting that bias for a moment and causing the 911 caller to really think about what that suspicious behavior is. But it's also a tool for a dispatcher to analyze if this is a bias-based call, if this is a false police report, that maybe doesn't involve or shouldn't involve police intervention. Departments should also work on developing guidelines on how to implement a restorative justice approach to hate-based incidents within their community. It's an opportunity if both parties are willing to have a conversation and bring healing to a community and address issues of both explicit and implicit bias affecting these false police reports and bias-based calls. So those were some of the areas that we looked into regarding bias-based calls for service. The second area we looked into was responding to mental health crises. And I'm very excited to be talking about to the board about this. It's such a pivotal time. We have a really unique opportunity to invite the community to come in and to tell us what they need. Just a few introductory statistics. About only 4% of calls for service involve a violent crime. For every 10 additional community organizations focusing on violent crime, or focusing on crime and community life, leads to a 9% reduction in the murder rate, a 6% reduction in overall violent crime rates, and a 4% reduction in property crime rates. When we look at those statistics of community responses and juxtapose those against the violence we see against those with disability, it leads us to the question of, is there a better response? In our country right now, 1 in 4 fatal shootings in the past 5 years involve someone with a disability. And about 50% of use of force incidents by police involve mental health. In order to better understand our path forward, we need to look at our past. We need to understand how we got to this moment in time. And so the report takes the direction of looking at a historical approach to crisis intervention. And this has been an issue that we've been trying to solve as a society since the very foundation of our country. In the 1800s, Dorothea Dix testified in front of legislators and Congress advocating to move folks suffering from mental health disorders or from cognitive disability from jails into state-run institutions that would provide treatment. And this is something that advocates want. And so what happened was folks were moved from the jails into these state-run institutions. Now, unfortunately, these state-run institutions ended up being almost as horrific as the conditions in which the people left. I think all of the members of the board here know, and from historical perspective, folks who were put in state-run institutions were subject to lobotomies, forced sterilization, forced medications, and restraint of their physical liberty and movement because of this disability. Advocates came again and started to fight for deinstitutionalization. And this is actually another victory by advocates. Folks came and said, these state-run institutions are inhumane. They are not treating with the people with disabilities. And so we need to release folks into community-based care to receive the proper treatment, and to protect the personal liberty of people in the least restrictive environments. And our legislators heard us. And in the 1960s, 1963, President Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Care Act, but it never got funding. And so by 1967, the number of those suffering from mental illness in our criminal justice system doubled. In 1981, Reagan severely limited federal funding for mental health, but deinstitutionalization happened in the 60s, and people had started getting released into the community without actual care or actual structure being in place for that treatment. Between 2009 and 2012, states cut $4.35 billion allocated for community-based care. California alone in 2012 cut $760 million in community-based care. Now we come to our present day, where we're at now. 20% of those in our jails have mental illness. This is 10 times more people with mental health issues in our jails than state-run hospitals. The LA County Jail is effectively the largest mental institution in our entire country. And 10% of deaths in custody involve someone who died of suicide. And so the board this year invited 2 experts to come and speak and give a panel. One of those was Vinny Ng, an advocate who has personally experienced what's at stake and a loss of a loved one. And I just want to quote from him kind of moving forward. We cannot arrest and incarcerate our way out of poverty, homelessness, and mental illness. We cannot continue to expect officers to be the guardians of safety, social workers, case managers, and counselors. And we also heard from Emily Lyles. Emily Lyles comes with firsthand experience as a licensed clinical social worker, working hand in hand with law enforcement to do crisis intervention responses. And so the next part of this report and kind of the vision this moves forward in, if you will, is still kind of following the timeline of crisis intervention. So we have the 1980s, federal funding was severely cut. And so police departments and communities started to develop responses. One of those first ones that were formed were crisis intervention teams, or what's sometimes referred to as the Memphis model in the 1980s. It was 1988. And it's fair to say this is probably one of the most popular programs even today. About 2,700 CIT programs exist across the country. CIT training is a 40-hour training for police officers. That's a 1-week training. Dispatchers receive an 8-hour training or a 1-day training when it comes to crisis intervention. One of the key components is a centralized drop-off mental health facility. And by that, there's an agreement between police departments and a hospital that they will accept those who are being taken to the hospitals. Some of the pros to this model, it's been proven to increase officer satisfaction and perception about use of force. There have been moderate cost reductions from diverting from jails back to hospitals. I think we need to be mindful of our past when we look at that. And the dispatcher training, which I talked about earlier in trainings for bias-based calls as well. Some of the areas that still may need improvement or that we should consider are this still has a police response to a mental health crisis. And this is a health crisis. And so I think we might, moving forward, need to explore different models. This is still using a jail or jails and state-run institutions. It's still using 5150s or hospital. And then the other alternative is the jail. The most troubling issue is it's shown to have little to no effect on injuries in police encounters. And so although it increases satisfaction and although it gives officers additional tools, I think it raises what else do we need? And so we get the kind of evolution, if you will, into the Kern County MET teams, or the mobile evaluation teams. And those formed in the 1990s. The Kern County MET team currently responds to about 3,000 calls for service per year. They are a co-response team, and that a mental health worker and a CIT officer work together in tandem. The mental health providers are actually a part of the 911 dispatch system. So they can either be dispatched through law enforcement or self-dispatch. One thing Emily Lyles brought to us and explained is sometimes the MET team self-dispatch. They recognize that there's a mental health component to the call and jump in to help and provide assistance. The MET teams also do provide CIT training to officers in Kern County as well. And one thing they've incorporated, and I spoke about a little bit in the bias-based calls, is Smart 911. And Smart 911 allows a user to input certain health information. So when a call or a crisis happens, all of that information is automatically given to dispatch. This is a great link from a law enforcement response to behavioral health care. They have a trained mental health crisis intervention specialist on scene. This is someone, as a licensed clinical social worker, has spent thousands of hours in training on how to do this. It's their profession. That's what they went and studied to do. And it's amazing to have that available on scene at the moment in crisis. Kern County, they're available 24/7, which is amazing. A crisis doesn't happen between 9 to 5. So we do need 24/7 coverage. Because it's such a large area, it is virtual. That being said, in the times of coronavirus, virtual treatment is becoming a new norm. Some of the struggles that they have, and generally with any of these programs, is funding. The funding does come from a general behavioral health fund, and then clients are also directly billed for services. There's been, and this is going to be a theme throughout, there's been issues connecting to long-term care. And the reason is there isn't a well-funded community infrastructure. And so no matter how amazing these teams can be, without a well-funded community infrastructure, it's difficult for them to be successful. One of the team or the groups to watch right now is called CAHOOTS. It stands for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. And they're based in Eugene, Oregon. And they formed in 1989. They're available 24/7. They're dispatched both through 911 and a non-emergency line, similar to the MET teams. It is a team of a nurse or an EMT and a crisis worker. What's really important here, though, is the crisis worker provides peer support. And peer support is someone who has personally lived through a crisis and can provide firsthand assistance to someone maybe experience a crisis themselves. That's something unique to this model, and it's something that, as we continue to explore best practices, may be an area to look into further. Folks, on top of their professional experience, being an EMT or a crisis worker, receive an additional 500 hours of training on top of their professional training. The heart of this is it's a mental health clinic that arrives at your location. They arrive in a van and respond to the person's location. And currently, the CAHOOTS program responds to about 20% of all 911 calls in the city. Alameda County right now is looking into a similar program and has been talking to the CAHOOTS program and forming a community-assisted transport team. Some of the pros to this is these are mobile teams arriving at the crisis location. We're able to triage while they're there and provide care in the person's home, so in the least restrictive environment. The teams are not armed. They are only armed with the skills of trauma-informed de-escalation and harm reduction. That's how they approach these crises. And notably, they've saved the city about $8 million annually on public safety and $14 million in ER costs. They are, however, still dispatched through both 911 and police. And so if you call, it may be cahoots are dispatched in conjunction with the police or just the police are dispatched. It's interesting, the leaders have expressed the ultimate goal is actually not to exist, that there wouldn't be a need for this transport, that there would be enough community infrastructure in place that we wouldn't need that liaison. One thing they are also mindful of is there's no one-size-fits-all approach. This is community-based care. And so the needs of Eugene, Oregon, which is a liberal college, predominantly white community, may not transplant or be a copy and paste, if you will, to a different community. And so each community needs to look at where those gaps are in care. New Orleans formed a crisis intervention model between 2007 and 2012. They have CIT teams and trainings for dispatchers on mental health. They use an engaged criminal justice sector, which helps redirect folks with disabilities from our jails into care. They are, however, growing their hospitals and inpatient psychiatric facilities. But they're still working on developing a strong network of community-based mental health services. They do partner with community-based organizations to help develop a system of care and provide a continuum of care instead of just a hospital visit. The department itself, although they've been working on this since 2012, are still reviewing best practices. I think communities and even the board moving forward, it's a big issue. And each community involves a different response, and best practices are still evolving and changing. Ultimately, in a recent report New Orleans issued, one of the struggles they've had is needing more community. Arizona has a very similar model. I'm not going to go through every detail of the Arizona model. Its centerpiece is 911 dispatch technology. And so it actually has information on bed space in particular hospitals, different community-based organizations in which folks can be transported to, and has received notable attention from the National Association of State-Run Mental Health Programs Directors. So that is certainly a model that folks are looking into. Moving forward, though, communities have been working on reimagining what public safety would look like for them. San Francisco is currently working on developing a crisis response model. Similarly to New Orleans, San Francisco recognizes that this is not a simple solution. This is something as a society we've been trying to find a solution for since the 1800s. But what they have done is they have gotten the community together. And so notably, they have folks from GLIDE, San Francisco AIDS Foundation, the Urban Academy, the Street Violence Intervention Program, the Meta Fund, and other neighborhood organizations all coming together in a steering team to talk about the gaps in community care and how they can improve crisis response. And so they didn't come out and just release a cahoots model. They recognized that even leaders, legislators need to listen to our communities, and that's where the answers lie. And so I think it's notable to look at how San Francisco is approaching that. One thing that's been called for, though, is moving a health crisis from the law enforcement sector back into healthcare and back into community-based care. a program that was developed in New York very recently. It's called Not 911, and it was created by folks who were formerly incarcerated about how to connect people to community-based care. And so it's an app for users to look at different community-based organizations that may be the most appropriate response to their crisis. And someone may feel hesitant to call 911, for example, because of immigration status. And so this gives an opportunity for someone to connect to community care without having to go through law enforcement. One of the models that has really been getting national attention over the last couple of months is Mental Health First. Mental Health First started in Sacramento this year in January and expanded to Oakland in August this year. They're similar to the Cahoots model and that they're a mobile crisis response team. It's a licensed EMT combined with a peer intervention specialist. And again, I can't emphasize enough the importance in this particular model to using peer intervention, to have someone at that moment be able to talk to the person in crisis and have personally experienced or lived through some of those things. They are struggling when it comes to funding though. So currently they only are able to operate between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And currently, because of the health concerns, they're only available by telephone. They are entirely volunteer-based. There's about a team of 30 volunteers who are available on the phone to respond to the person in crisis. And they refer to the folks they respond to as participants, not patients, because they want peer-based support. They want to provide a bridge to a larger base of community care, but most importantly, they want to provide voluntary, violence-free, and trauma-informed care. Like I've said throughout this presentation though, without funding community infrastructure, it's difficult for any of these models to be successful, whether it's a co-response model like a MET team, or it's a model like Mental Health First that operates completely separate from law enforcement. In this, in the outline, I included several bases for funding that folks may be able to consider, including the Mental Health Services Act, AB 109, or Public Safety Realignment. And there was funding under the Coronavirus Relief and Economic Security Act with regards to mental health and substance abuse. We're not certain if that's going to be available next year, but there are some tools for communities to look at how those funds are being spent. And so just to kind of sum up, and I'll turn this over to the board, looking at bias-based calls, community-based organizations have really advocated for a restorative justice approach. That seems to be an area where increased dispatcher training could help in dealing with both bias-based calls and then also these calls for service that may have a mental health component. Moving forward, I think it's really important to be mindful of our past and how crisis intervention has evolved to this point. But the answers don't lie within our legislator, they lie within our community. And so that's where the answers to community-based care comes from, is our community. And the San Francisco and their approach in forming these steering teams is maybe something to consider. And with that, I turn it over to the board.
Thank you so much, Kendall. Really appreciate it. And this is a really, really interesting, and I'm very impressed with all the work you've already been able to accomplish. Because I agree, I think we all agree, both of these calls for service, when you have bias by proxy, and the mental health related calls are huge topics, and there's huge subtopics within each. Now, what I would propose, because I would imagine we all have lots of questions, and there's going to be a lot of discussion about this, if you can stay on, how we structured our agenda was to hear from the public, so we could consider, public comment, and then they come back and then, get back and then discuss it and ask questions we may have about the various points you made. Okay? So we'll do that. And then for all the board members, then we'll have an opportunity after public comment to further engage with Kendall on that. So with that, Kendall, is there anybody else from DOJ that's going to be making a presentation right now on the draft?
No.
Okay.
Okay.
So I'm going to open this up for public comment, and I'm going to start. We're going to go geographically and ask folks who would like to make a public comment. You'll be able to unmute and make your comment, and we can set aside about 2 minutes or so for public comment. So I'm going to open it up to Northern California. If there's any public comment from Northern California. Okay. I'm not hearing from anybody from Northern California. I'll move down to Central California. Any members of the public from Central California who would like to make a public comment? Okay, and I will now move down to Southern California. Anybody from Southern California, members of the public that would like to make a public comment? Okay, so then I think we can turn it back to our subcommittee and members of the board, and to open it up if anybody has questions of Kendall or any observations or anything they would like to discuss with respect to the presentation.
So can I go, Angela, if you don't mind?
Yes, you can. Sure.
Okay. First of all, Kendall, that was excellent. I sent you a private check that I want you to check out, but I thought that your presentation was spot on. I do, however, want to make sure that the board members and our subcommittee and members of the public know that we have to be aware that implicit bias occurs below our conscious level. And sometimes when callers call, it is not really based on race or ethnicity. It could be a real situation for them. And so when I'm out and about in the country speaking, I don't understand in law enforcement why when someone calls us that we don't make it standard that we make contact with them. When someone calls about someone walking in their neighborhood, they've never seen them before, they're uncomfortable, we should be able to either make contact personally or make a phone call, because if we don't start to educate people that the person they made contact was okay, it was your neighbor, it was somebody walking through, then they're going to call again. And this is not a 2-year-old problem. This is a 50, 60, 70-year problem. And I have worked with agencies where sometimes we think the person who's calling, because it seems to be based on race, that they're either racist or whatever. And it just could be that in their experience, they may have real fear that something has occurred in the past, and they're feeling that fear. And if we don't make contact, even if it's just a simple phone call, to educate people who are calling us, to say, hey, I spoke to the gentleman or the young lady and she's fine, there was nothing illegal going on. Because if we don't make that contact, when something happens that's negative and we don't talk to the person, we're the ones that are holding the box at the end of the day. And I really believe in community education. The education is going to come, unfortunately, from the police department. But if we don't start telling people that the person that's parked out in front of your house pulled over to use the phone, every time somebody pulls over in front of the house, they're going to dial 911. And we need to start cutting back on those calls. The education portion of that is the reporting party may say, oh, the last time I called, the police told me it was okay. And we don't want to discourage people from calling. We want you to call. But we really do need to start to educate people to start to calm those fears and those concerns, because human beings that live in homes and communities have bias. And part of that is we have to try to educate them. But good job, Kendall. I appreciate it.
Well, Sandra, this is Angela. On that point, I'm wondering, and I'm looking at our draft report, and maybe something for the following year, some of the work we can do. And are there agencies that are doing a pilot project, or it could be in California or it could be elsewhere, in doing the follow-up that you're talking about, and what those experiences have been?
Make sure I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know any project that's going on. When I teach and when we talk about bias by proxy, part of that training discusses having empathy, not only for the person in the car or the person walking down the street. Might not be the first time that a nice police officer has come along and said, hey, what are you doing in this neighborhood? But also to have empathy for the person who's calling, because not
Right.
everybody that called is a racist. And so that's part of the training that I provide in my organization, to make sure that when officers are called out on bias by proxy, it's not always an illegal call, or I'm looking at our draft where it says a person may be ill-intentioned when they call, although there is a sentence in there about even folks who are not ill-intentioned call. But I really want to make sure that we understand that the person may have a real concern, even though it's based on bias or real fear, and that we should go to those calls. And then after the call is cleared, and then we should make contact. And I don't know that any agency in California or even in the country, maybe that's something we can look at, or maybe we can start here with maybe a smaller agency to see how that works out. Because what do? We go into homes for domestic violence and we mediate. We go into residential burglary. We tell people, don't leave your garage open if you're in the backyard. Make sure your doors are locked. Make sure you don't leave valuable items in your car overnight. People can see it break into your car. Then we should be saying, Ms. Johnson, the person that you called that was parked in front of your house was okay. They were doing nothing wrong. And by the way, the spot that's in front of your house, that's a public street, is not your property. So it's okay if people park there. And I know that's a big concern in residential suburban communities. People think they own that spot, but it's okay if people park there. And if we don't educate people and, in a nice way, and tell them, yeah, we don't mind coming, but I just wanted you to know that that person was okay, then they think they did something for the police department. So the next Saturday when they see it again, they're going to call you because they think that's what you want. And we do want you to call, but we also want to educate people. That's my suggestion. So maybe that's something we can talk about for next year.
Right.
On doing either best practices, or maybe, we can, send out some information to ask, hey, do your officers make contact, and have your calls gone down because of the education? Because it's 2020 and we're still going to these calls because somebody doesn't recognize somebody walking down the street.
Right. And I do remember when we had the presentation about the Kern County program, there was that part of the program where the dispatchers kind of, at least for repeat callers,
Mm-hmm.
And some of what you're talking about may be people who make repeat calls, and some of maybe the education that's happening around that, and that may be something to follow up again. Not necessarily for this report, because I feel like it's already so rich. So we have so much information in the draft right now. But something looking forward is if we're thinking about some law enforcement agencies who are maybe trying to look at this restorative justice model, or at least a follow-up, which is related, that may be a agency to reach out to, as well as I know in our report we talk about the CAH may be able to put us in the right direction on that.
But I also last thing I'm going to say, if we can get to the person on an initial call, maybe we won't have any repeat calls.
Yes.
Yes, if we can educate our community members, hey, love you to call. This is what happened. This is your concern. Is there any reason why you thought that there was something that made you nervous? We're talking an extra 5 minutes of a conversation, because maybe that person won't call again. And if we could do that 30,000 times a year, maybe people will call when they have something that's real concern, that has some evidence of criminal acts that are occurring, not just somebody walking through the neighborhood.
Any other board members want to talk about that issue or anything related to that?
Yeah, I have two comments. First, I wanted to respond to Sandra's comment. So my only concern with that sort of model is then we're sending an armed officer out to educate a potentially biased or well-intentioned caller, and we've seen that go really wrong. I mean, that's how Elijah McClain died. And so can we perhaps suggest that, you know, a community educator or somebody else go out to that caller rather than an armed officer who's trained in a different way? I mean, perhaps some officers do have that training, but a lot of them don't. I mean, this presentation shows that. So that would be my first comment. My second comment is more towards Kendall, but perhaps we can get to that later, which is with the restorative justice approach, I like the idea, but then I think about the 7-year-old girl who's going to then have to engage in a conversation with someone who found Black Lives Matter so offensive that they called the police. And I just feel like that's putting the onus on victims of racial discrimination to do the work educating others. And I understand what restorative justice is. You know, I have a pretty deep background in education, and so I know that it works in schools. But for these particular kinds of very painful, often calls, and I know sometimes perhaps they are well-intentioned and sometimes they really are motivated by racial animus, to then put the onus on someone to engage in a conversation, I mean, I don't know. I think maybe that works. I don't know how that would work. And I just think about that 7-year-old girl and what she'd have to do in that conversation. So perhaps there are models where it works really well, but I'd like to hear more.
So, Sahar, really quickly. So across the nation, obviously here in California, we get calls every day. These calls are daily. And so the officer's responding anyway to the call. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that the officer knocks on their door and says, hey, you called us. It could just be a phone call as they're leaving the area. Hey, we're responding to your call. We arrived. This is what we did. Everything worked out fine. You know, the person was using, because if we go and nothing's wrong and then we don't say anything, then the person who made the call thinks something was wrong because we got rid of that bad person who was parked out in front of my house or who was walking down the street. I'm not discussing mental health. That's completely different. But law enforcement officers across the nation are getting called on a day-to-day basis that there is someone that I don't recognize in my neighborhood that's just walking by. They called 911 or they called the non-emergency number, and an officer's going to show up. And all I'm saying is, if we don't educate, if we don't have contact with that person to say everything's okay, and we just get in our cars and leave, then we leave them to educate themselves. It said, I called the police, a person's gone, I must have done the right thing. That's all. Because the cop's going anyway. An armed person is going to respond to that call. Mental health, completely different. I agree with you. But those calls that I'm talking about happen every single day, all day long, throughout our country. Because people are uncomfortable. It doesn't make them bad. It just makes them human, and they might have their own bias based on their own personal experience that something happened 10 years ago, and they're reacting to that, and we should help them to get beyond that. That's all I'm talking about.
No, and I hear you, Sandra, but my concern is there any way that a dispatcher perhaps can, I mean, I don't know, you know the inner workings of how this works, but identify, okay, so someone says there's somebody parked outside my house, they look suspicious. And the dispatcher, I think, could discern that parking outside of someone's house is not a crime. Does an officer have to get dispatched for those calls? You know, and if it's identified as a bias-based call, then can there be a call made by someone who isn't armed to the biased caller, rather than an officer going out and monitoring something, perhaps misconstruing it, and something tragic happening, as we've seen happen many times?
So that's by policy for each agency, whether an officer has to go out or not. Some agencies today don't send their officers. They look at the call. If there's no articulable facts that show suspicious behavior, it's just a person sitting in the car. A vast majority of agencies require there has to be some contact. Officers can go, the car leaves, no big deal. Officer goes, they kind of observe to see if anything suspicious is happening, And if nothing's going on, then they're going to make contact by their policy for each agency throughout the country. So I tell you, law enforcement officers don't always want to go to those calls because they get it. But then on the other hand, sometimes I hear cops say, well, that person's racist. Every time a black person parks in front of the house, they call the police. But what if that person who calls is not a racist, but they have some clear fear because they were robbed before and they see that person out, and maybe it's not that person, but they have that bias. And so if we don't go and say, how you doing, Miss Johnson? Talk to that guy, talk to that gal, they're fine. There's nothing. We have to start to balance out that bias that everybody that parks in front of your house is not a criminal. That the person who parked in front of your house is going to your neighbor's house for dinner. The person who parked in front of your house is buying a house across the street. The person who parked in front of your house pulled over to use the phone. And that's my biggest concern, is that if we don't start to educate. Now, agencies throughout the state would have to create all new policies on dispatch calling, but then dispatch is busy sometimes, and so then they can't make the call. And so I don't know how to fix that, but I know that if we don't start telling good people that the good people that are parked in front of their house are not committing any crimes, they're going to continue to call. And I've been going to those kinds of calls since 1982 in my organization, and finally we just stopped going because, we were violating people's rights, like the concerns that you have. Excuse me, how you doing? I'm Officer Brown. What are you doing in this neighborhood? Where are you going? Where are you coming from? Do you have some ID? So we take a consensual contact and make it into a detention because somebody's uncomfortable with persons walking in their neighborhood. It's America. People can walk anywhere they want to if it's on public property. And I don't know, how do we educate the community? I have no idea. Angela?
Yeah. So, well, I'm just looking at our draft report, and we look on pages 12 through 13, and Kendall, you may have some questions about this. So we are addressing some of this, in this year's report, and talking about, a little bit of what San Francisco is doing, and then laying out, what some of the best practices may be. And on page 13, we do talk about, helping dispatchers, getting them trained on how to recognize these type of calls where there may or not be an articulable criminal activity in progress, and that right now in our draft we talk about an officer should only be dispatched if there is actual suspicious behavior. And then we talk about the restorative justice piece on that. It would be interesting, and it sounds like from what you're saying, it really is a department by department policy issue as to whether you always are dispatched, and I would imagine there's lots of subjectivity, and there's dispatchers and officers have to use a lot of critical thinking in this. But that, I don't know, Sheriff, if you have an opinion on this, but that our recommendation about only dispatching an officer if there is actual suspicious behavior, is that more common, or are policies typically do not include that? I'd be interested, and that may be some work we do down the road. Or Kendall, you may, in looking at this, have some data on that.
I'm not sure what other policies are, but if someone calls our dispatch center and has a concern about somebody in their neighborhood or a car parked out front that's suspicious for some reason, the questions from the dispatcher will follow up. Why is this suspicious? What makes you nervous about that? And try to get some more information from the caller. And then if the person says, well, I'm a single female with young kids at home and I'm worried there's been burglaries in my neighborhood and I don't know then sure, we're going to send somebody. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But I think Sandra is right on track, and I think that's just good customer service. When, in our case, the deputy leaves that call, you may not want to go back to the house and knock on the door and talk to him because maybe you don't want that person to know who called. But you can pick up the phone and call them and say, listen, this person isn't from the neighborhood. They're there for a dinner engagement, or they pulled over to use the phone, or whatever the case may be. Or you can say, you know what? Thanks for calling. That person was up to no good. They were in a stolen car. They're going to jail, on and on. So I think that's important to provide feedback, and that's just good customer service. Mm-hmm. And we can't always do that because of workload and a variety of things, but I think it's important to provide that feedback. And then we all will know, based on our computer-aided dispatch, if the person is a habitual caller. And I think that's then where you need to take some action. If the person calls 3 times a week for a suspicious person or a suspicious vehicle, that's not normal. And so maybe we need to go down a different path. And it may be that they're biased for one reason or another, or it could be early onset Alzheimer's, or it could be a variety of different things that maybe we can address in a different way to help reduce that call for service if we possibly can. But I'm not in favor of not sending deputy sheriffs or police officers to people's houses without very specific data. Some people can't articulate things as well as others. And I think if a person calls and they're genuinely scared that there's somebody in their neighborhood, in front of their house, whatever it might be, then I think the expectation should be a law enforcement officer shows up to assist them, or at least investigate to make sure that there's nothing that they need to be worried about, but also provide that feedback as well.
And clearly, all I wanted to say was that not everybody that calls 911 with a bias by proxy case is a person who is ill-intentioned or a racist, or, they could generally, that's all I was saying, that we should really speak with them. Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
So I wonder then, in our report, and Kendall, this may be something that you want to address too, is, when we talk about, some best practices, and I think this issue we're talking about is, related, is a piece of restorative justice, that follow up, that we would encourage departments, when they're able at a minimum to follow up in some manner if the call didn't lead to, an actual, issue, and so that the individual calling can get a better understanding. And there could be some education along the lines we've been talking about.
I would suspect you would find more often than not they do that when they have time. I don't know that it's written in anybody's policy. It's not written in our policy, but we encourage that because it's good for community policing, to be quite honest with you. I mean, responding back to the person that called and giving them a heads up or an update as to what happened and what we did in that particular case, and I think it's good. Education is good, and also the communication with them is good. So, I'm not a big fan of sending surveys out to every law enforcement agency in the state to find out if they do or they don't, only because then I have to assign somebody to do that, and we've got a lot of things to do already. But I bet you would find that more often than not they take the initiative. I mean, every law enforcement officer, deputy sheriff, whatever, has a cell phone. And they're on the cell phone all the time. They're calling the person, even though they're dispatched by computer, they're calling the person saying, I'm on my way, or I'm running behind, or I got delayed because of this, and communicating back and forth with them or trying to get more details on their way. So they're talking on their phones all the time. Okay. My guess is more often than not, they're calling the RP, in this case, a reporting person, and giving them an update after they leave.
Okay. Well, then it sounds like, and if anybody doesn't agree, please, speak up, that just adding something to the report, encouraging any department that doesn't do this to do follow up, and why the follow up could be important. With the sensitivity, Sahar, that you're talking about, it doesn't have to be, sending, I don't think we're talking about sending like an armed officer to see someone's door, but it just could be, often it sounds like it's going to be by telephone or somebody from the department following up that way.
Yeah, I don't think there's any harm in encouraging that. And I think more often than not, they do it by phone. Some folks don't like uniformed law enforcement going to their door and knocking on it, and then all the neighbors go, what were the cops doing at your house?
Yeah, and I wasn't suggesting for a police officer to go to the caller. So my concern was more that when a call is regarding something that's discernibly not illegal and seems to be motivated by bias, that when we then go and send officers out, then that can result in pretty disastrous consequences, and there are well-documented instances of this. And so, I don't know. I think if we're going to go out for the sole purpose of educating and investigating and educating my suggestion would be that if there are models where when something is discernibly not illegal and seems to be motivated by bias, that an officer not go out, because I understand that the customer service and people being scared. However, what's at the root of that sometimes, and who is that at the expense of? If someone is scared of someone because of what they look like, then our customer service comes at someone else's expense. That's my concern.
Yeah.
Valid point. And the example that Kendall uses, I'm not sure why a deputy sheriff or a law enforcement officer showed up for a 9-year-old writing in chalk on their own driveway. I mean, there must be
Exactly.
a bit, there must be, and my guess is there's more to that story than we know. But I mean, we wouldn't respond to a call like that. I mean, what's the reason? We got plenty of other things to do than to go to a house where kids are playing in the driveway, writing in chalk on their own driveway.
Well, Sheriff, I would respond to that call and get down on the ground and write chalk on her driveway too.
There you go. If you have time to do it, I think that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. But short of that, there's no crime.
Nope.
I mean, it doesn't make any sense to go there. We got plenty of other things to do.
That's true.
I have a question for Kendall on this issue we're talking about on the draft report. If Kendall is on. And on page 12, we talk about, we have kind of these bullets about, how officers can identify a bias-based call, how sworn personnel dispatchers should interact with community members who has made a bias-based call for service. The policies that would include those characteristics, have you seen, like in San Francisco, who is now starting their new policy, have they addressed, at that kind of level already, the best practices, or are we envisioning, like maybe in the next report, to kind of flesh those out? Because again, I'm sure it's not everybody's going to be in agreement on the best practices on each of those bullet points, how to address them.
Well, and the bullet points up until we get to dispatcher trainings are actually recommendations from the 2020 book.
Okay.
But certainly, I think that's an area that we could explore further in best practices and policies, particularly when it comes to dispatcher training as well as officer interaction or potential education taking place at that time too. So that's certainly something we could look into.
At the dispatch, so the training for dispatchers, you're saying?
Both that, but also policies when it comes to responding generally to bias-based calls.
Okay. And so are you thinking, based on what kind of literature is out there already, that could be something for like the next report, or actually incorporating more information about that in this report based on kind of what you think is available now?
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I want to make sure that I'm serving the board the best I can. I think that would involve going through folks' policies to see on an individual level how each agency is approaching that. And there are numerous law enforcement agencies within California. So I think that may be something that we could look into for a future report.
Yeah, okay.
And really flesh out this issue.
Yeah, and we can talk about it as a subcommittee. I mean, maybe we don't need to do a full review of everybody's. We may have some test cases of trying to look at, some that we have heard of that maybe, have been more recently improved or changed, and take a look at those. So we can address that down the road. Alicia, was there anything that you wanted to add on this or any related issues?
One question that does come to mind when I'm reading the report and hearing Kendall, thank you, Kendall, for your presentation, is interested in when we use the word peer, right? Like a lot of these, these models that we have in here do use the word peer support, and what does that mean, and what does directly impacted mean, and what is, people who've also experienced either mental health crises or have experienced, police violence, or have experienced violence or perpetrated violence. a little bit more in terms of making sure that everybody is included. I was very interested in the one that was, I think, New York 911, that was by directly impacted people. But also just want some clarity around the term peer and the other ones. Making sure that it's also people who have experienced arrest, who have experienced incarceration, who have experienced what that means, what these calls turn out to be, right? If it is that you're sending law enforcement to someone's house, and that it's not just, social workers who have social workers who have been trained, who have the experience, who have the education, is very different than somebody who's directly impacted. And that term itself has been, can mean so many different things. So interested to know which of these, and if there are other models that are more community-based, which means that it's, to me, more directly impacted individuals.
So, yep. And going back to now talking about that aspect of the report, I really like the fact of knowing and talking about both the historical context and the context of the fact that our communities right now, that we don't have that strong of a long-term support system, because I just think that it puts in context kind of, now where focus is the actual call for service, and how, best either, these new models can function either alone or with law enforcement. And I think I'm really glad that we're including, both kind of bookends of history and with the long-term, some structural problems we have, to help focus the discussion about, well, what is the best model for law enforcement and non-law enforcement to respond to these calls for service that have individuals are having mental health challenges. And so I'm really glad we're keeping that in this, that we have that in this year's report. But now, I guess as a subcommittee, do we, like looking down the road, like for next steps, do we want to keep examining each of these models or different models? I mean, again, I think about these issues and they're just so, these are such critical issues and there's so many layers to them. And so I would be interested in hearing from subcommittee members whether, in looking at these models, should we be focusing down the road on a few of them and try to compare them? And I like the idea that, Kendall, you talked about that, we don't yet have a lot of data as to how effective some of these models are, and being able to, see if we can get data about those to be able to kind of compare and contrast. So I think that would be important for us to talk about, like, where do we kind of go from here? If others don't have, like, if they have other suggestions about any changes to this draft, kind of what do we do next?
So, Angela, I'm going to agree with John McMahon that it's very difficult to send out surveys to agencies.
Right.
Because like you said, then you have to find somebody to do it.
Right.
The information, it should be pretty easy with a computer-aided dispatch on calls for service. And if the information is put into the computer, then the computer can put out a report. I think that if we specify what we're looking for, then we can just get one report that takes maybe 10 minutes or less on the calls for service for that particular agency over, let's say, a period of time. I wouldn't want to do 20 years, but let's say we can do it from January 1st to January 1st to June 1st, which is my birthday, by the way. But anyway, June 1st, to see how many calls of service over the last 6 months have we had. Can we look at that information from CAD, from the CAD dispatch, and were they calls for service that were based? We can read it and say, well, I think that one's a bias by proxy call. And then look at the outcomes for those. And then maybe, see, my interest is, how do we reduce those calls? And we look into January 1st, 2021, 2021 to June 1st, 2021, to see if, because of the education over the previous year, did those calls slow down? Because we're wasting a lot of money, time, resources, and that's when we could be doing other things. I don't necessarily want to send out a survey where 100 officers have to fill something out for calls of service. But if the information is being captured through CAD, then we should be able to pull that information out, send it to the Department of Justice. Perhaps we can look at it over, between RIPA and the DOJ, and look at it over a 6-month period of time through this subcommittee and say, oh, okay, yeah, they get a lot of calls for service. And it looks like a lot of these calls we could shut down by educating community members. And however that education, that's a completely different subject. But I would just really like to know how many agencies are responding, what's the outcome of the calls. And I think we can get that off CAD, I think. What do you think, John?
We can definitely get the suspicious vehicle or suspicious person calls, and we can also run the dispo of the call.
Yeah.
Necessary action taken, arrest, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
It probably would be difficult to tell whether or not it's bias based.
Mm-hmm.
So without reading each call, and it depends on the size of the organization. We handle about 1 million calls for service a year. So I don't know how many of those are suspicious vehicle or suspicious person calls, but somebody's going to do a lot of reading if we're going to go over an extended period of time. Might be better to look at a smaller agency, or even another idea would be, what if we took one of the stations in our department, for example, a smaller city, and looked at trying a pilot. If we required the deputy to make that follow-up call with that person, and then monitor those calls for 6 months after we do that, and see if there's any difference in. It'd be a stretch probably. You'd have to have maybe DOJ has somebody that can analyze it, but maybe a pilot's a better way of looking to see if it's an effective way to reduce those calls, and then have some analysis done to prove that if you do it this way, we tried it in 10 different agencies in 10 different places in the state, and it worked.
Yeah. I don't want to look at 500,000. You said you get 1 million calls a year. I don't think we want to look at 500,000 pieces of information, but I do like the pilot. And I will be honest with you, Northern California, the middle of California, and Southern California with medium, maybe small to medium sized agencies, because the calls for service in Chico are going to be completely different than the calls for service in, East Palo Alto, which is our 1 square mile small agency, compared to what's happening in, like the Inland Empire. I would be interested in that. If we, like John said, if we go to a larger agency, we're going to find ourselves in trouble. I just want to get a feel for what's going on in the country, in the state.
I like that, voluntary, or agencies that we could reach out to that kind of meet those characteristics, so that they could be a little bit, there's going to be, like you said, regional differences, but maybe similar sizes, and then we can, that could then be very informative.
Yeah, I would agree.
One thing that just came to mind when I was listening to, the conversation was how even the way that law enforcement categorizes it, the term suspicious, right? I feel like callers now use the term suspicious when they really just mean unknown, right? Or they mean something else. And by having the community have to say that out loud, I'm calling because there's an unknown car, I feel like they might start checking themselves, versus I'm calling because there's a suspicious car. I'm calling because there's a suspicious person. You don't really mean, that's where that bias comes in, and they're hearing it, right? That's where language matters. So I'm wondering, in terms of when we're doing these potential, piecemeal throughout California, if we're looking to see if that language is being used throughout, and if so, if one of the recommendations can be a change of language, and that might also check the bias, right? And make people start realizing, no, I'm really calling about an unknown, i.e. bias. And it's not really about a suspicious car. It's not really about a suspicious person. But yeah, we incorporate that. We hear what law enforcement uses, and we use it, and we know that that's the trigger to get law enforcement out there. Use this term. Use it, right?
But Felicia, a lot of that also, those biases come from television too. They see
Oh yeah, which is
stuff
law
on
enforcement. Like
TV. Yeah.
law
You know,
enforcement, not it's not all TV. It's TV that benefit law
focuses on
enforcement,
law
right?
enforcement. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, but by someone saying that out loud versus like I'm calling because I don't know this car in front of me, you're
Hmm.
that's really what you're calling about. You're not calling about a
Yeah.
suspicious activity. You're now using that language, and how do we, as maybe as dispatchers or as law enforcement or as a community, start making people be explicit to where they're starting to check themselves versus using the terminology that they know is coded like it's coverage.
And therein lies the problem. Because I can get a room full of cops and tell them this is how we're going to do it, but who's going to train the community? So many times it might have to be the dispatcher. So do you mean suspicious in criminal acts, or do you mean you've never seen the car before and it's unknown to you? Because then it can start to change right then and there in asking the question. Because I agree with you. My father was bad on that when I was a kid. There's some kids in the grove next door, and I thought I saw something suspicious, and then the cops go. But he wants to get the greasy wheel, the noisy wheel. He wants the cops to come to that call, and so you're right. The coding causes a problem because then we have our mindset that we're going to a particular suspicious call when it really is just I've never seen that car in front of my house before, which is not criminal.
No, yeah.
Yeah.
So, if we go this route, as we can partner with those agencies, if we have 3 agencies and kind of incorporating these ideas into, okay, this was going to be a part of your pilot, can you incorporate this into the pilot project, as to the language that's being used, the follow-up that's being done. And this could be a really interesting project.
Yep.
Okay.
Can I take just a minute to go back to the mental health portion?
Yeah.
I think we touched on it a couple of times, but Kendall has a great job on presenting the historical perspective of the mental health issue that we all are dealing with currently. And I think it goes back to what was initially said in the beginning of the call, that law enforcement's being asked to do more and more and more. And so just as an example, we have 7,000 jail beds in our county. About 6,000 people in custody on any given day. Prior to COVID, now it's about 5,000. So using the 20% model, and that's pretty darn close, to be honest with you, that means 1,000 of them have mental illness that are in our custody. Pretty significant. And the reason that they're in county jails is because there's no other place for them. And they've committed a crime, and because they're mental illness, they're incompetent to stand trial. So if there's no place in a state facility, they stay in a county jail and either decompensate, or in our case, we run a restorative competency program partnered up with the Department of State Hospitals, where they help pay for beds inside of a county jail to restore people to competency, get them through their court case, their case adjudicated, and into services somewhere outside of a jail facility. That goes on day after day after day. And to be quite honest with you, those people have no business being in jail, but there's no other place for them. And to take it a step further on the street, we're hearing a lot of discussion lately about mental health professionals responding to calls for service to deal with people that are in crisis in one fashion or another. I would love to see more about that. We do a lot of that already, partnered up with our folks in behavioral health in our county. But I'm here to tell you the folks in our county are not responding to a crisis call where the person's violent. They're not going to do it. They've already said they're not going to do it. And so it's a great idea. I would just love to see it in practice where they can respond where the person in crisis is not violent and they come up with a solution that works. Now, there's opportunities for mental health professionals to ride along with law enforcement, and we do that in some cases, and we have great programs where they deal with the folks that are on their caseload, and if they're off their meds, they get them back into treatment and try to help them along, but they're not violent and they're willing. So with the calls we generally get are a person that's acting out, they're violent, they're off their medication for whatever reason, they're not willing to comply with family or friends where they're at. I don't know who else is going to respond other than law enforcement. I would love for behavioral health to deal with it. They're trained in that, and our deputy sheriffs are not as well trained. But I don't think they're going to go, because they're not going to go in our county. So maybe there's places in the state where they're going to go into that situation where there's potential violence, or a person that's in a mental crisis that has a weapon or whatever the case may be. So I think that needs a little bit more explanation and exploration, to be quite honest with you, because I hear it and I love it. It's a great idea. I just don't know how it's going to work practically. And maybe I'm missing something, or maybe our folks here from behavioral health are just not interested, and others are across the state. But if anybody knows of mental health professionals that are responding to crisis calls where the person's violent and not willing to get help, and they're solving it without law enforcement, I'd love to see the program. I'd copy it in a minute.
Yeah. Yeah. On that, yeah, that's what, in reading these materials, because I do think, and I really like that we have this overview of different models, but along those lines, I was thinking it really would be interesting and important, and maybe our work going forward is kind of comparing, just pick maybe one or two. And if there is one where law enforcement, that these teams are totally non-law enforcement and they are responding to a call where there is a potential for violence, how is that working? For us to take a deeper dive into that. And then a model, which seems like there are several where it's, the joinder of law enforcement, with some mental health professionals responding together or working together, and how are those doing, and especially where there is the same potential for violence. I do think personally that it would be a really important area of inquiry, because I think that's what a lot of communities are facing right now. And it may be also in how we're defining violence and how that even is evaluated at the beginning of these calls. So
if the mental health professional arrives at the house and say there's not much in the way of violence, but maybe the person's just unwilling to get help, it'd be an interesting scenario as to how they force them into treatment if they're not willing, without writing a 5150 application. So there has to be something there a mechanism to get that person into treatment that's not willing. So the models we use here work well with our homeless team, with behavioral health with them, going out and offering the variety of services that can be offered, housing and mental health services and all that. And that works well. The other models at our stations are those that are probably already on a caseload with behavioral health that start acting out, and the deputies will tell the behavioral health worker that John Smith was causing some problems last night at home, wasn't really violent, but is probably off his meds, he probably needs some help. They'll then follow up with them and try to get treatment outside of law enforcement. That works if they're willing. If they're not willing to get help and there's no court order in place, it's pretty difficult to force somebody into mental health treatment short of a 5150 app. And most clinicians that are working the street don't have that authority, at least the ones in our county don't. Sandra, maybe there's other models.
An area then, so for maybe bringing in, as we did with the panel before, where we can really do some, really direct kind of conversation around these issues.
It's a great idea. I'd love to see it in practice.
Yeah.
And successful.
Kendall, in your research so far, I mean, has you seen much discussion along these lines that we're talking about?
It certainly has been concerns raised by the community. I would challenge this board to look further into the mental health first model. It is entirely volunteer based. And so instead of patients, they're participants. And it's a different way of looking at mental health or crisis response. It's part of kind of when we look at our past in the historical perspective, it's always been jails or mental health institutions, and specifically state-run institutions. And our sheriff addressed that as well when it comes to competency in someone potentially decompensating in our jails and jumping back and forth between our jails and our state-run institutions, which is the problem. And so mental health first, I may be willing to give a presentation, but that's the approach that they have. Similarly, as I mentioned in the presentation, Cahoots, although they are dispatched through the 911, they respond to a majority of these calls, and they are not armed. They are licensed clinical social workers.
Mm-hmm.
But what makes them unique from a hospital setting, right, the state-run institutions, is they have a peer intervention specialist. And by that, it's someone who has lived through a crisis, someone who has been in a psychiatric facility, or someone who has been incarcerated as a result, largely of a disability. And so that peer intervention specialist creates a unique relationship with that person in crisis that maybe you or I couldn't, just because we haven't had that shared or lived experience. But I challenge folks to think outside of what we keep going back and forth between, which is our jails and our state-run institutions, our mental health hospitals, 5150s, when there's a whole continuum of care that can be provided. And so instead of looking at as something even potentially violent, I think we need to be mindful when we use those words. It may not be a violent response. It may very well be a misunderstanding of how someone's perceiving their reality. And so even using those heavily charged words when we talk about mental health, I think we need to be careful. That being said, I think there are a few models that are developing that are worth looking into. And those include mental health first. Although they're local to Sacramento and Oakland, they have been featured on a national stage and may very well be one of the paths forward that doesn't involve the jails or state-run institutions. The mental health occurs in a wide variety of ways and presents in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I mean, what I would propose is for, one of our next meetings and is to have, if we could invite, representatives from Cahoots or Mental Health First to come speak to our subcommittee, and we can have that conversation and learn more.
Well, I think that's a great idea. And if I could get out of the responding to mental health calls for service and housing them in the jails, I think we all win.
Okay. Anyone else on the subcommittee with any questions or remarks about our draft report or any of these issues?
The one thing too, Kendall, that I think about, like kind of when you're talking about national scope, I wonder if we've thought about or if it's within our model to maybe think about international, because as you kind of talked about how we think about the jails or we think of state run, and it's really because historically, nationally, that's where we go, right? But that's not true in the global sense. And I know that, we have different laws here. We'll go back to Constitution. That's how we think of 5150. But if this is really the time to be talking about community responses, it might benefit us to put in this report to think outside of our national lens, right? Because our national lens is law enforcement. And so that might be at least have one or two models in terms of other ways that they have responded. And it could be potentially, as, Sheriff Mann said, like he doesn't know if mental health professionals respond to violence. That might be true in California that they don't, but that doesn't mean that globally they don't, right? Here, that's where we go to. We go to law enforcement. That's what we think of. That's historically our context. That's the one thing I wanted to add, international or global, potential landscape, at least like, one or two models in here.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that would be really interesting. And because it may also, in looking at, another country's, policy or program or approach to this, it may be that there's other pieces involved. For example, like their infrastructure for long-term care for folks, that's different. That could also help inform, other policy changes that, when you look at this whole holistically, that there may be more support for individuals with disabilities, after the crisis, or for, outlets, or, the funding is different in these other, whatever, another country, and kind of looking at it, maybe that's a different way and approach for California as well, because we can't just, it may not be just fixing the actual response call, but what happens down the road. So, yeah, I would be, I don't know, and I would imagine there is going to be some literature on this, how other countries address these type of issues.
Well, I'll tell you this, we don't know what we don't know. And since it's been this way the last 30, 40 years, 50 years, we don't know what the models in the future are going to be. But I can tell you right now, a vast majority of law enforcement officers do not want to go to the mental health calls because they are so sensitive.
Yeah.
And I think I said it when Vinnie Ing spoke. My sister's husband was killed with police contact after having a mental illness situation, and he died from positional asphyxiation. Those cops didn't go there planning to do that. They didn't say, okay, let's go and let's asphyxiate this person. But it happened because police were called, and, that situation, I won't go into details, but, my sister does not have a husband, hasn't had one for a while. And I'm quite sure it's hard for law enforcement when that happens. It's hard for the families. It impacts families for years, and it impacts the law enforcement officers as well as the agency. And something to what Sahar was saying, when we go to these calls, sometimes things don't work out well. So I don't know what the answer is in the next 50 years, how we're going to do that, but I almost guarantee there's going to be some change that's going to have to come.
Yeah.
That's going to have to come. And I don't know. And a lot of that is based on money. The programs, everything's based on money. And I think in this country, we spend a lot of money on things we don't need to spend money on. And we need to start moving monies in order to help. Because sometimes people criminalize homelessness and they criminalize mental illness. We got to get away from that.
Yeah. And I think there are a lot of families who are left with, they just don't have anywhere to go, with loved ones and what to do. And I think there's much needed support for people. That's lacking.
I just to circle back, I have children causing chaos outside of my door, so I did not hear. Did we address the restorative justice issue that I brought up while I was perhaps calming the chaos outside?
And this, let me go back to, and the issue about, the idea of the example of the little girl, putting her in a position where that could also be, traumatizing or not in her best interest to be involved.
And so I don't know, because I know that this is definitely alternative method that's promoted in the education context, and I know folks who are looking away from, policing being a solution to every problem, but this one in particular rubs me a little bit the wrong way. And I don't know if maybe it is a best practice because of, again, I feel like it puts the onus on the person who is the subject of, identity or racial-based profiling to prove their humanity almost, but maybe I have limited thinking, and I'm curious to hear from Kendall about what came up in the research and where this is done, and if that is an issue that's also addressed.
That's certainly an area of expanded research. Largely, it came from the Communities Against Hate, so those 15 organizations who really kind of collaborated in coming up with how to respond to hate-based incidents. But your point is well made, right?
Yeah.
How is a 9-year-old girl supposed to react in these situations? And I think that's really important. And so ultimately, it's the board's vision moving forward. I'm here to put things on the plate. And so I'm really interested in your feedback and everyone's feedback on all of this. But those are well-made points, and I think something we should consider in how we recommend best practices in responding to these bias-based calls. It does allow for community healing and acknowledges that on one end, but at the same time does not put our little girl at the the very moment, or being responsible, as you said, for educating the neighbor who did make that bias-based call.
Yeah, and I actually I remember this coming up. I forget her name, and she's in the report. The bird in Central Park, the bird watching
Cooper?
incident. Amy
Yeah.
Cooper. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I remember reading about the reactions to this, and folks who are typically on the side of like divesting from police even were very opposed to her being charged. So what I'm curious, and because they're more into like divesting completely away from criminal justice solutions. So I don't really know what an ideal solution is, because then there are people clamoring for her to be charged because she did cause harm, and she could have caused the murder of Christian Cooper, right? Yes, but yeah. So I don't know. Do you mind? I would love to look into this further. Maybe we can be in touch over the next week and just see what else is out there, because I know you've done a tremendous amount of work, and I'm really curious about what a model response is to those types of incidents.
I think that's an absolutely great idea. And I think Anna Rick has something to add as well.
Thank you, Kendall, and thanks to everyone on the call. I just want to I don't have the solution for this. I think the conversation needs to be continued, but I do want to add to the conversation that historically LGBT communities had kind of a lead role in some of the penalty enhancements for hate crimes, and there's been kind of an evolving position in organizations and communities that saw that those policies led to more harms to the communities they were intended to protect. And I would strongly encourage looking at the models. There are definitely cases where restorative justice is not an appropriate response. And again, that has to be, the people engaging in restorative justice have to feel that that's a safe option for them. I personally had engagement with the Southern Poverty Law Center and doing restorative justice work in response to hate crimes in Atlanta. And the kind of that is a powerful model for the people engaging in that program, because the perpetrators of the crimes were also from marginalized communities, and a criminal justice response there wasn't necessarily going to lead to really a positive outcome for anyone involved. Yeah, so I just want to bring that to the conversation and encourage additional research and maybe a closer look at some of those models and how restorative justice can be established as an alternative, but not necessarily the only alternative, because there will be cases where it's not appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally acknowledge I have not looked into this in the way that the Department of Justice had, or looked in particular at restorative justice as a response to bias by proxy calls. So that might be the ideal model, and it might be a very successful one, but I would be curious to look into it. And it's a philosophical question too. I mean, it's just, I don't know, just having everything I said. So I think, thank you. That's really helpful to have heard about how it's worked in the LGBTQ community, and I'd like to learn more.
Right. So maybe then at a minimum, and for this report, that we should maybe build in here, if we're going to suggest that agencies implement it and have guidelines of when it might be appropriate. So it's not like necessarily, as you've been talking about, that it's always going to be appropriate. And that maybe then is work that we can continue to do as a community, because it sounds like there's many layers to this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense.
It's not a one size fits all. In the example that Kendall gave, and going back to what John said, I wouldn't even go to that call. And I've heard calls across the nation. Black kids mowing someone's lawn, somebody calls the police. So the police show up and start helping them mow the lawn, or some, in one instance where a kid was selling lemonade, the police showed up, all the police showed up and bought the lemonade. I mean, I love those situations where we can educate the person across the street just by having positive contact with people we're coming in contact with. Because the other issue is we want to have and engage with our communities in a positive way as much as we can. When I think restorative justice, I start thinking of issues that are crime victims of crime that we're trying to fix issues with. The simple stuff. The police are trained; they know what to do on situations where they either won't go to the call or they will go to the call with plans on educating from afar the person, the little girl. I would have laid down on my stomach and drew on the side her driveway and then waved at the neighbor across the street, because there's nothing wrong with that. And sometimes that's all a person needs to be educated on. Say, oh, well, maybe I should have made that call. And then we're not arresting people for calling the police and making biased calls. And we want people to call. If we start arresting people, then people are not going to call. So I'm done with that, but thank you.
Any other comments or questions from the subcommittee on this year's draft report or our vision for the future? Okay.
Angela,
Yes.
really quickly, this is what I have down for our next steps. Looking forward to choosing a few agencies to look at calls for service that are around bias. I also looked at continuing to have mental health calls for service, and I like what I can't remember if it was Sahar or Felicia that said let's invite somebody from those groups, from Cahoots or so forth. I like that. I think we should look a little bit further into that. And then the restorative justice, I think Sahar says she's going to look into that. I would like to see some examples, maybe one or two, where restorative justice on a bigger scale was used in a situation that came out positive, and one that came out negative, maybe.
That's what I have. I think on this last point, because we're talking about unintended consequences, perhaps. And the one thing with this report, our draft report, that we were going to just add that to encourage law enforcement, to the extent they're not already doing it, following up on unsubstantiated calls. I think that, I'm not sure, Kendall, if that's in the report right now, but in those bullet points, but to add that as something we would encourage. So with that, if nobody else in the subcommittee has any other comments, I'm going to open up to a second public comment period we have on our agenda before we go into just finalize our next steps. So do we have any members of the public in Northern California that would like to make a public comment? And any members of the public from Central California that would like to make a public comment? Okay, finally, any members of the public from Southern California that would like to make a public comment? Okay. So with that, I'll turn it to next steps, which I think we just actually has summarized. We have one addition to, a couple of additions to the draft report, a reference about encouraging law enforcement to follow up in some manner with unsubstantiated